Hello, and welcome to Sustainable Outlook, a podcast from global law firm K&L Gates, where we discuss the transactions, technologies, and trends in the sustainable economy. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Please reach out with suggested topics or guests, or questions about how we can work together to create a sustainable economy.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. For those who are new listeners to the series, Sustainable Outlook explores sustainability as it relates to our world today and into the future. We talk with guests who are on the front lines of creating a sustainable economy, who share their perspective on sustainability, what it means, how it applies to their organization, how they identify and implement sustainability goals, and what they are doing at their organization to move us further toward a more sustainable economy. I'm Molly Barker, your host for today's episode and an attorney in the environmental and energy practice at K&L Gates. I am very excited to be joined today by Courtney Blodgett, who is the Director of Strategy and member of the founding team at Edo, which is a startup joint venture based out of Seattle, Washington, that is still in its nascent stage and is working to enable building-to-grid integration to decarbonize the grid and reduce building costs, as I understand it at least. We'll hear more from Courtney. Courtney has 20 years of experience working on clean energy, innovation, and sustainability. She was the managing director of Brooklyn Microgrid, one of the first peer-to-peer energy trading platforms. She led the impact investing team at Vulcan, the family office of Microsoft's co-founder Paul Allen, with a focus on clean tech investments. She was a climate change technical advisor to the United Nations in Rwanda and to the UK government. She has worked on clean energy projects around the world and is on the board of Oiko Credit US, Carbon Leadership Forum, and Enables Us. She also is the founder of Yield Positive, a blog about sustainable investing for the everyday investor. Thanks so much for joining us, Courtney.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to get started, tell us first about what brought you to Edo and specifically into your role there as Director of Strategy, as well as what you do in your role as Director of Strategy.
I ended up at Edo in one of those kind of random chance settings in the world. So a few years ago, I was doing an Earth Day cleanup with my neighbor, who at the time worked for McKinstry, one of Edo's parent companies. And as we were picking up trash in our neighborhood, my neighbor suggested that I speak to the chief market officer at McKinstry, Ash Awad. And my neighbor heard about my passion for energy and innovation and climate change. And he said, well, you will find a very kindred spirit in Ash. And I did. So I had a meeting with Ash, and that was the start of my journey with McKinstry. So I was with McKinstry for a little over 2 years. And during that time, I was part-time developing the business case for Edo and the concepts that stand behind Edo. So I was part-time with McKinstry, part-time with Edo, working with the managing director of Edo, who is Hendrik van Hemert, to form Edo, which launched officially at the start of last year. And then at the end of last year, I joined Edo full-time as the Director of Strategy. My Director of Strategy role is one of those kind of catch-all positions. So I do a bit of everything. I do the strategy work, so help with business plan and high-level documents that guide our vision as a company. I also do marketing work. So that is looking at the external market, where the market is going, and then thinking about what are our key messages to share to our stakeholders about what Edo is and what we do. I do a bit of sales, and then I do anything in between, because when you work for a startup, it's kind of all hands on deck. So where there's a gap, I jump in and help fill it.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. So just as a part of that, does that mean that you're part of the process of working to expand Edo's footprint then? And what does that look like? Just curious, really quick before we move on.
So definitely on the sales side of things, that is working to engage more customers. Our main customers are utilities, and we partner with utilities because we believe that is how our solution can scale and how we can really make a difference. And so I do quite a bit of work of understanding what utilities are looking for, speaking to different utilities. There's some pretty innovative utilities in the US And they're really exciting to talk to. So I get to be part of those discussions and discussing with them how we can further the clean energy transformation with a solution like what Edo offers, which I'll go into in a little bit.
So can you talk a little bit about the history and birth of Edo then, including who Avista and McKinstry, its joint venture backers, are?
Avista is an investor-owned utility that is based in Spokane, Washington. McKinstry is a building service provider that is based in Seattle, Washington. And the two companies work together on this really amazing development that is based in Spokane. So the Spokane South Landing Eco District is one of the largest zero energy and zero carbon developments in North America. And this development was created as a partnership with McKinstry and Avista. It was built on the site of what was supposed to be a new utility substation. And instead, McKinstry and Avista said, well, what about if we designed a development of buildings that could respond to the grid needs? So instead of building new grid infrastructure, we built this building with all the elements that are needed so the building can help to meet the grid needs when the grid is stressed, to help to shift load, and really have it be part of the grid system, and be what the world talks about when we talk about grid interactive buildings. And so South Landing Eco District was built and is operational. And so during this process, the partners said, wow, we really want to scale this concept. We want to scale this concept because it is such an important part of the clean energy transition. And so the two partners decided to form Edo. And so that's how we were created.
Great. And so currently, which problems, because I'm sure there are a number of them, is Edo working to solve right now?
At the high level, there are three problems that we're really looking to solve. So one is to address the climate crisis. I mean, we all know what is happening, the extreme heat events and the impacts on people, the economy, and the environment from climate change. And the built environment causes 40% of global emissions. So about a third of that comes from embodied carbon, which is emissions in the materials of the buildings. But more than 2/3 of that comes from, actually closer to 30% of the 40% comes from the operations of the buildings. So the energy used by the buildings on a daily basis. So Edo really is looking to figure out how do we enable buildings to operate more efficiently and to operate in a way that allows the grid to get cleaner. Because as we're putting more renewables on the grid, we're seeing some challenges with the grid, and buildings can be part of the solution that reduces those challenges from adding more clean energy to the grid. The second problem that we're working to address is equity. Climate change is disproportionately affecting lower income and disadvantaged communities. And that's something we bear in mind in every day of our work. And so we are looking to try to reduce the impacts of outages, for instance. The research has shown that outages happen more often and last longer for disadvantaged communities. So we're trying to work to be part of the solution of reducing power outages. And then the third problem that we are trying to solve is affordability. Energy cost is a huge burden on lower income communities. And as the clean energy transition is happening, energy costs will continue to increase, not just because of the clean energy transition, but because of the state of the world in a lot of different ways. So the more that we can do to keep energy costs low and also potentially provide new areas for revenue for disadvantaged communities, the better. So those three problems kind of frame everything that we do.
Yeah, that's great. One question I do have about the first pillar you mentioned, the question of building materials. I know that you mentioned that is part of the issue with building a building's carbon footprint. Edo, it sounds like at this point, isn't necessarily working on building materials, but is it something that Edo is considering in the future to look at or partner with other companies? Is it kind of being addressed in parallel by other organizations? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, embodied carbon is definitely a growing area of concern for the entire built environment sector. As energy gets cleaner, that percentage of about 10% of emissions coming from embodied carbon and 30% coming from operations will shift because emissions from operations will decrease as the grid gets cleaner. So embodied carbon is something that everybody in the built environment should be paying attention to. I'm very passionate about it. As was mentioned in my intro, I'm on the board of the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is one of the leading organizations working on this. And I encourage people to go to our website. We have a whole suite of material about embodied carbon, it's the Carbon Leadership Forum. But I would say generally it's something we're all aware of, we're paying attention to, and our role is to enable this transition to a cleaner grid, because that in the long run also enables built environment materials to be produced in a way that's lower emissions.
Got it. That's helpful. So of those three problems that you mentioned Edo is working to address, how is Edo, working to solve them? Is there any specific milestones you guys have achieved lately on these or are kind of shooting for?
Maybe I'll start with just a little bit of what we do. I've kind of mentioned the drivers and our history, but what does Edo do? So Edo works with channel partners, so namely utilities, to implement cost-effective energy efficiency and demand flexibility programs for commercial and industrial customers. So that's a mouthful. So I can break that down a little bit. So first off, energy efficiency. So this is reducing energy that is used. Our solution in general saves commercial industrial customers about 9% per year in energy costs through implementing lower no cost activities. So that first and foremost, as we think about clean energy, we want to reduce energy. They say that the cleanest kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour not consumed. So that is really first and foremost. How do we try to reduce energy efficiency through operating buildings more efficiently? The second part is that demand flexibility, which is this building to grid integration. How do we enable buildings to respond to what the grid needs? So what the utility communicates is important. And so that a lot of that is, how do we reduce these peak periods? So energy is consumed throughout the day by all buildings, and most consumption happens, what's called the peak period. It happens between about 7 and 10 in the morning and 6 and 9 in the evening. And so when utilities are planning for how they're going to meet needs from all the end users, they have to look at those peak periods and think about, where can we get energy? What type of energy do we use? What is the lowest cost energy? And so we are working to try to reduce those peak periods, because often those peak periods are met by the dirtiest and the most expensive energy sources. So that's often natural gas generators, and diesel generators. So natural gas power plants and diesel generators are turned on because they can turn on really quickly to meet those peak periods. So Edo is looking to, how do we reduce overall energy and how do we shift when consumption is happening, and how do we reduce those peaks? To put it in a context that maybe the everyday listener can understand. So many of us receive mailings from our utilities saying, well, you can get these free energy efficient light bulbs, or if you replace your boiler with an energy efficient boiler, you will get a $500 rebate. So those are actually utility energy efficiency programs that are administered by third parties to help the everyday person kind of save energy in their household. So we are trying to do the next level of that type of program with commercial industrial customers, because commercial industrial customers have traditionally just had these rebate type programs. And our solution is different. It's data driven. We're working on a monthly basis with the the facility manager to say, where are there opportunities to reduce temperature points, to change set points that will save you energy and also just reduce the impact on the grid because you're using less energy or using energy at different times.
I know that you had mentioned on the equity component that some commercial buildings in disadvantaged communities, if they are part of this program, potentially could monetize off of this. Is that another component of it? If they have distributed energy resources on site, that they could actually essentially be part of the solution as well? Is that another thing that you guys are looking at?
There are pilot projects being run by utilities all over the country to try to engage different types of customers and energy efficiency programs, but then also what is called demand response programs. So the demand response program that most people have probably heard of is in California. It has happened for a couple of summers that to try to prevent wildfires, to try to prevent outages, the utilities ask people to increase the temperature in their home by a couple of degrees in order to reduce the stress on the grid from air conditioner use. And so that is an example of demand response at a residential level. Traditionally, demand response at a commercial industrial level is a utility calling a factory and asking them to shut down for a day and then paying the factory for that shutdown. So what we're trying to do is to help bring another type of customer into this equation for demand response and energy efficiency. So these harder to reach commercial and industrial customers. So we are working with hospitals, we're working with community centers, we're working with schools. So buildings that are typically left out of these programs, we're able to work with them and to give them a real value add from what we offer through a dashboard where they can see what their energy consumption's happening, how much they're paying for energy. They can do better capital planning. So we are working to kind of bridge the gap between only households that have smart thermostats or that can turn their air conditioning down a little bit and these large factories.
Got it. So I do want to ask a little bit about, how you anticipate utilities evolving. But I did want to just ask before that, if the problems that you're working to address right now, the ones that you think will continue to be the biggest issues in the next 10 years, or do you think there's a larger issue that's coming down the pike in the next 10, 20 years that Edo nor other similarly situated organizations are prepared to address? Is there anything of that nature, or is it kind of already you guys are attacking the behemoth of issues?
Not to sound like a broken record, but climate change is really the biggest issue of our time, and it impacts and will continue to impact every aspect of social justice, of the economy, of our world. And so the more that we can do to reduce emissions and prevent outages and add additional revenue streams for customers, the better.
Yeah, no, that's great. And how do you anticipate utility programs evolving to include grid interactive buildings?
That's a great question. So utilities have historically been a bit of a slow-moving industry. They're a natural monopoly, and they have some pretty strict regulatory mandates. And so innovation has not always been what they have focused on, but things are excitingly really starting to change. They're starting to change because a number of things in our economy are changing. So one is the rise of electric vehicles. So electric vehicles are changing when energy is consumed, how much is consumed, where it's consumed, and that will continue to change as the number of electric vehicles in the US grows and as we have more fleets that are electric. We're also seeing a push for the electrification of buildings. So this is removing natural gas from buildings. So you have a number of cities throughout the country that have banned natural gas in new buildings. So that means heating or cooking that was traditionally done by natural gas will be all electric. And so that's also changing the consumption patterns. And then on the other side of things, so our grid infrastructure was built for one-way electricity flows. You have the generation that occurs off-site somewhere and then is put through the transmission and distribution lines and arrives to our buildings. Now we're seeing this huge growth in distributed energy resources. So you have electricity going back onto the grid. And grid infrastructure just wasn't traditionally built for this. And so these two things, coupled with customers kind of demanding more from their utilities, demanding that their utilities focus on climate change, that their utilities focus on equity, is changing the ecosystem for utilities. And we also have some pretty amazing regulation being passed at a state and local level that are pushing utilities. So we're seeing utilities starting to look at their whole system differently. So they're starting to think, well, how can we do energy efficiency in a different way? They're starting to think, how can we bring buildings into the solution for the grid? We're seeing innovative utilities like Puget Sound Energy, which is in the Pacific Northwest, doing requests for proposals saying we are looking for solar, battery, and demand response from buildings that can help to be part of our energy system. And so we're going to see more of this from utilities. We're seeing California doing innovative things. Texas is a hub of innovation, the Northeast. And we'll start to see this everywhere, partially as we're dealing with increasing energy costs and the impacts of extreme weather events and increasing outages.
Yeah, that is pretty fascinating to think about the different changes that they're undergoing right now. So distributed energy resources, we've talked about them already a little bit. They're increasingly being sited on or in buildings. What do you see as a challenge for wide-scale DER implementation?
I would say the challenge are these issues that I previously mentioned. So one, that the two-way flow of energy is not how the grid is built. And so we have stress grid infrastructure. So that means that infrastructure has a higher potential for outages, and it impacts the reliability of the grid. And we're also going to see the cost from needing to upgrade infrastructure. And so this is where Edo comes into the play. We can work with buildings in the geographic area where there's a stress piece of infrastructure to try to reduce and shift load so that that infrastructure doesn't need upgrading or needs it further down the line. So there's definitely that challenge with infrastructure. And then the other is just, how does supply match generation? California has this famous duck curve that they have a large amount of generation in the middle of the day from solar, but a lot of their consumption is happening outside of the times that solar is being generated. So how do we deal with the difference in timing between generation of coming from DERs and consumption? And the variability that comes from solar and wind and hydro. The wind doesn't blow upon command. The rain doesn't happen upon request in a way that we have been used to when you have a natural gas or a coal or fossil fuel power plant.
Yeah, I'm sure that just underscores the need for further development of storage innovation as part of this equation. Is the vision for Edo something unique and uncharted, or is this strategy and set of hardware and software something that has been executed in other regions of the U.S.?
Lots of pieces of what we do have been executed by other companies. So software, there are many software companies that provide what are called energy management information systems, EMISs, and that's something we provide to our customers. We have a dashboard where building managers can see what's happening with their energy consumption and their cost, and that utilities can understand at an aggregate level where there are opportunities for conservation and flexibility. So you have software companies. The only piece of hardware that we currently use is what we call a gateway. And this is a device that helps to pull data from buildings. And so there are other gateway companies And then you have service providers that are administering energy efficiency or demand flexibility programs. And I would say we're pretty unique because we combine all three of those things. We have, the knowledge, we have the software, and we have the hardware to implement our programs. And we also take a bit of a different approach of this channel partner approach that we work with utilities, and all of our programs are branded with our customers' brand. So they're branded as the utility. They're not branded as Edo. And we take this approach because we just believe it is how we can scale the most, because utilities touch every building and because utilities are a known and trusted partner by the buildings.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that building to grid integration may become more pervasive in certain regions of the nation more quickly than others? And if so, why is that the case?
There are definitely a number of different factors influencing it: market design, cost, regulation, and I'll speak to two of them. So one, regulation is a huge driver. So take Washington State, for instance. We have this really kind of groundbreaking regulation called the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA. And CETA is pushing utilities to act in a very different way. Utilities have to really think about their emissions and their impact from climate change. They have to think about equity, and they have to think about innovative solutions like different looking energy efficiency programs and demand response programs that include a much wider variety of customers than they are used to working with on demand response programs. So regulation is one huge driver of innovation in building to grid integration. The other one is the cost of electricity. So the cost of electricity varies really widely throughout the country. And so in some parts of the country where you have really expensive electricity and you have really expensive what's called demand charges for commercial and industrial customers, those are charges during those peak periods. So when everybody's using energy, commercial and industrial customers often have to pay more per kilowatt hour for their energy. And so when you have that really strong economic incentive to reduce energy or to shift energy, that will be a big driver behind grid interactive buildings, is reducing that cost for customer.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think that on this question then, obviously it sounds like some states that, like Washington, pretty progressive state, I know that CETA is similar to a law that was rolled out by California is there a chance that a state that may have a lot of sun or a lot of wind, more so than other states, factor into this at all in terms of what resources they have? Or is that less of the formula that goes into which regions of the U.S. will make moves on this more quickly, and more has to do with policy?
Renewable energy is one of the drivers behind grid interactive buildings. And this is partially because of this variability and mismatch between supply and demand question that I mentioned earlier. So if you have just more solar during the day, the more that we can do to shift consumption to the times when sun is shining, the better. And that enables to rely more on solar. And in the instances that, the sun doesn't shine in the way it's expected, if we can then reduce load or shift it to a time where there is lower cost energy that is available, that really enables buildings to play an important part of dealing with the generation and consumption challenge, as well as, oh no, the sun's not shining as much today as we're used to. So this variability challenge as well.
Yeah, I bet. What do you think Edo's next big goal is then in the evolution of grid interactive buildings, or just more broadly speaking?
We actually are kicking off a really exciting project. So last year, the Department of Energy launched a call for connected communities projects. And so there were over 250 projects that propose this concept of grid interactive efficient buildings. And Edo was gratefully one of 10 winners of this grant. So that was really exciting news for us. So this is a project that is based in Spokane, Washington. We have amazing partners, including Avista, Pacific Northwest National Labs, McKinstry, and Urbanova, a Spokane-based nonprofit. And this grant will really prove out this concept of grid interactive efficient building. So we will target our work around a substation in Spokane that is nearing capacity. And we will work with buildings that are on the feeders connected to that substation to reduce and shift load. And this project is really exciting for us because it goes beyond just our traditional commercial industrial customers. We're also going to be working with residential customers, multifamily homes. We'll be working with distributed energy resources. So there'll be solar, there's electric vehicle charging, there's batteries. So we have this amazing suite of partners, and we're going to be addressing this opportunity for grid interactive efficient buildings from all angles, from all building types, from all resources. And seeing like how much can we shift and reduce load and just reduce the stress on this substation. And we'll be sharing all of our lessons learned widely over the course of the 5 years of the project.
Wow, yeah, that does sound very exciting. Well, I will be interested to hear the updates on that as they come. Thank you, Courtney, for your thoughtful and informative responses to all my questions. And thank you for those of you who are listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about Edo, Courtney can give you some thoughts on where to visit for more information.
Our website is edoenergy.com. And we are on LinkedIn on Edo Energy. And we would love for people to reach out to us via our website or on LinkedIn.
We hope you will join us again soon as we continue to explore the intersection of environmental, social, and economic sustainability. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainable Outlook. To listen to past episodes and receive notices for new episodes, subscribe by searching Hub Talks, that's HUB Talks, in your favorite podcast app. We hope you will tune in next time to learn more about the outlook of the burgeoning sustainable economy.